Welcome to Innovation in Government. I'm Jason Miller. My guest today is Craig Harber, the Chief Technology Officer for Fidelis Cybersecurity. Craig, welcome to the program.
Great, thank you.
Let me set some context for our discussion today. Just over a year ago, the Office of Management and Budget released the first ever cyber risk determination report. Craig, you probably remember that well from your time at NSA. The report was damning about the state of federal cybersecurity in many ways. OMB says the risk assessments showed that the lack of threat information results is ineffective and also leads to allocations of agencies' limited cyber resources in an ineffective way. That in turn creates enterprise network visibility gaps. Now at the same time, the report also provided hope and some optimism. Initiatives such as the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, CDM, or the DHS Government Cyber Architecture or GovCAR review are giving agencies more asset visibility than ever before. And policies, such as the latest one on protecting high-value assets, are starting to have an impact as agencies focus their protection efforts in these areas. These and many other efforts are giving agencies a path to consolidate and integrate their cyber tools. To move further down this path, agencies need better, not necessarily more, threat intelligence. They need security operations centers that combine and make sense of internal and external threat information, and top it all off with advanced analytics to help human experts make sense of the mountains of data. So how do agencies reduce risk, consolidate architectures, and most importantly, successfully defend themselves from nation state and other cyber attacks? Well, Craig, that's where you come in. Craig, let's start with some specifics. Cybersecurity professionals are facing huge challenges. I went through just a few of them, but really one of the biggest ones is the need to simplify and really consolidate cybersecurity infrastructures. Talk a little bit about where the state is and where they need to go.
Sure. And if you don't mind, let me do a little bit of quick background of kind of my experiences at NSA, because I think this leads into some of the recommendations I'm bringing forward to the community. So as you mentioned, I did spend 30 plus years at NSA, and part of that time was working on an effort called NASCAR, which is NIPRNet, CIPRNet, Cybersecurity Architecture Review. The NIPRNet being the government's unclassified network, CIPRNet being its secret network. And that work really was a result of a number of breaches that had occurred over time. The DoD CIO at the time had called NSA down and really challenged NSA to really rethink the current investment strategies. Part of where that effort led to was really defining a new methodology. And I think some of the points that you were making at the front end, which was we really needed to understand how the adversary was behaving and making sure that our investments were complementary and actually were able to detect and to respond to those types of capabilities. So as a result, there was something developed called the NASCAR Cybersecurity Framework. Today, it's actually referred to as DODCAR. There was a reason for that name change. But it has also evolved in the DHS market to something called GovCAR. That work was based on a lot of really good industry work. MITRE, for example, had produced the attack framework. Lockheed Martin had its own cyber kill chain. So it really was a best of breed analysis of what is the adversary doing and how do we better defend against that. And so it allowed us to really assess the technologies that are out there. And the technologies that are employed across the DoD and the intelligence community, the rest of the federal government, really are no different than what you see being deployed across the commercial sector, the private sector, across all verticals. Everyone's experiencing the same set of challenges, and it's how to essentially be able to react and respond in cyber relevant time, which I think is the key. Because I think traditionally, I think there's a lot of reports out there. There's a Verizon report that talks about cyber dwell time and how long it's taking to essentially, attackers are getting on our networks, and it's anywhere from hundreds of days they're out there before they're being essentially redacted off the network. And so really taking those concepts and trying to bring those forward. And that's really one of the big things, and I think the big challenges for the community. Just to give you a sense of the complexity of the problem that we're really facing, is the way architectures really had evolved over time, the security architectures, and it really doesn't matter whether you're talking government or industry, they've really been cobbled together, right? Every time there was a new attack, we essentially looked for a new product, and those new products really were solely focused on a particular attack. As a result, if you look at a number of the different industries out there, there could be 40, 50 vendor products in a stack. And just imagine the complexity of that. Vendor products that really don't share information well together, don't work well together, aren't integrated. And as a result, we've effectively created even more seams for the adversary to essentially attack through. And so really part of the kind of the recommendations that we were bringing forward in that report, and that I'll say is my role at Fidelis, is how do we help our customers streamline those security stacks to make them more effective, more reactive to kind of the challenges that are ahead of them.
Now, I've had similar conversations with vendors before about this, if you will, just incredible increase of the number of products, tools, services that they've sold and agencies have bought. Put your NSA hat on for a second, right? Is the onus on the government to say, hey, I have this tool already, what else can it do? Or is the onus on the vendor to say, hey, you have my tool already, here's what else it can do, instead of every time there's a new RFP out, a new RFI out, looking for new tools? I mean, I know blame goes both ways, but now that you've seen both sides of the fence here, which side do you lean toward?
Well, actually, it's a great kind of question comment, because one of the significant findings in the original NASCAR report was the fact that of those large number of vendor products that are within the security stack, they're not fully utilized.
Right.
They had a lot of capabilities, and most were 30% or less utilized. I think the other thing that we found is a lot of duplication of capabilities, because certain people like certain products, so you would see multiple firewalls, multiple IDSs, multiple IPSs. The redundancy just was almost ridiculous. And so kind of where do I come from on this? I think as where you're looking at streamlining the security stacks, I think the first thing to do is really kind of self-assess at every agency. Where are we today? What capabilities do we have? Where do we have redundancy? Where can we remove the redundancy or the duplication? And then look for, so what is a holistic solution? And so, you know, one of the things I'll say I bring forward as well, because of the work that I did at NSA, is that, so how do we think through what does a complete security stack look like? How do I get complete coverage? And so even though the original cyber threat work that was done was meant for kind of initial investment strategies, trying to help the DoD leadership think through that, that same framework can be used really to assess the completeness of coverage, right?
Let me jump in, because when you talk about completeness, I think, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. We know that there's no such thing as, well, we know that there's one way to have a secure computer system is to, right, bury it in a lead box underground. You've heard the joke before.
Sure.
So when you say completeness, help me define what you mean.
Sure. So when I'm talking completeness, and the best way to try to describe this is thinking about the adversary. The adversary has tactics, techniques that they use in order to execute their operations. And so we have a really good understanding of what those are. We have them documented in this risk framework. And what we want to be able to do is measure how well we can protect. So our security solutions, do they protect? Where can we detect, and how can we respond? And so ideally, and you'll see a number of vendors that are doing this today. They're taking, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and they're being assessed. How well can they essentially address a particular APT, an advanced persistent threat? If we would do that for the entire security stack, and I'll just take, for example, the Fidelis security stack, we really have a complete set of sensors. Other companies that are out there have similar types of sensor grids. But we can look at that and say, for example, what if we could cover 60 or 70% of all of those techniques out there? Then the question is, what other vendor partnerships would we need to identify in order to try to cover the stack? Now, when I say 100% coverage, the reality is it's 100% coverage of what is documented and known. The reality is the adversary is changing. The adversary is always looking for new techniques, right? And so even though it's 100% coverage, the reality is we have to constantly look for ways to identify, I'll say, the unknown activities, right?
I was going to jump in and say the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns, right?
Correct.
And
absolutely.
I think the last piece of that is the one we know we don't know a lot about, meaning because of the changes that happen. And so going back to the completeness, let me just put a finer point on this. When you have when an agency is looking at their current security architecture and the tools they have, I think it's one, figure out what you have. Second, what's redundant and what do you really need? And then two, when you talk about that completeness, it's those three things, right? It's the ability to detect, to respond, and to protect. I think if you can kind of fill those buckets with your tools, that's how you achieve or get closer to that 100% solution.
Yes, and that's kind of what we've been, from a thought leadership perspective, have been pushing, both when I was at NSA and now that I'm within industry at Fidelis, is really that is what we're advocating is a way forward for all agencies, at least think through the problem in a kind of a methodical way.
So walk me back through it. So we got the understand what you have, understand what's redundant, and then what capabilities you need. What are some of those next steps, if you will, that an agency can go through to really relook at their security architecture, make sure it's getting toward the completeness?
Right. So I think that's actually the first step that they have to do, right, is, and you mentioned, for example, the CDM program at DHS. And there is a large number of agencies that are going through the phases of that program. Part of going through that phasing is going to assess what capabilities do you have against those new set of requirements that are identified in each of those phases. And then, because again, here's the reality, right, is all the agencies, whether it's we're talking federal agencies or within the private sector, they've already have investments in hardware, in software. And they need to make a kind of a conscious decision of where do they essentially eliminate costs and where do they add new capabilities and how do they add them in a integrated and automated fashion. One aspect that we didn't really talk about is do the agencies and organizations actually have the skilled workforce to even operate these platforms that we're talking about, right? And so you'll see across even industry, there's opportunities for managed services versus does the network owner and operator perform the analysis and the operations themselves.
I think in the next segment we'll go down those two kind of roads of managed services, workforce. But let me come back around because there's one thing around this idea of understanding what you have and how it works is there's going to be blind spots. So as a Chief Information Security Officer or CIO, how do you kind of go down that path and say, how do we identify what we don't know? Right.
So from my perspective, blind spots is kind of the one of the most critical issues to address as part of this. I think over the course of my 30 plus years, I don't know that I ever went to an agency or to an organization who fully could identify all the assets, right? All the devices that are actually on the network. And so that's a real challenge, right? There's assets that I'll say that are managed assets that we have agents on, and then there's a whole set of unmanaged assets, shadow IT, all types of things that really fall under kind of the Internet of Things. And really, in order to remove those blind spots, you need to have complete visibility on all the devices that reside within your network and understand all the paths that connect those devices. Another important aspect is, when you're really thinking about operations, what is the configuration of those devices, right? And are those devices vulnerable? Do they need patched? There's a whole set of cyber hygiene things that would come into play there as well. But not only understanding your assets, but what are the critical assets, right? Where are the most critical assets and what are the paths to those assets? Because that's really what the adversary wants to think about when it comes to lateral movement. How do I get presence in your network, create a foothold, and then what are the steps that I need to do to get to those most critical assets? So unless you have really that kind of full visibility of all your assets, those blind spots are where the adversary is going to essentially kind of operate from.
I think that's a great point we have to worry about because we can go back to all the way to 2015 when we found out about the Office of Personnel Management data breach. they had some blind spots and ended up costing them a lot of data. Craig, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.